Hello everyone, this is Caillou, and welcome back to Month 1, a series of 3 videos in which I go over the impact that the custom set Blood Like Rivers has had on the custom format Revolution during its first month in the format. Now, if those words meant nothing to you, Revolution is a custom card constructed format made up of 6 custom sets. It aims to emulate a standard-esque environment. If you want to learn more about brewing and playing in this format, check out the links in the description. Blood Like Rivers is the latest set to be added to the format. It was added a month ago. And in that time, it has had a strong impact on the meta, creating new decks out of nowhere and augmenting existing ones. I'm going to be talking about that impact today and going over the top 10, well, maybe I'll be cheating a little bit, but let's say approximately top 10 most impactful cards from the set during the first month. If you're interested in learning more about the format and jumping in with it after looking at some of these cards, there's also an additional video in this series where I go over the meta of Revolution right now as a whole. It'll also have deck lists that feature some of these cards. So if you're just watching this casually and go, hey, I like that card, I want to play with it, check out that video as well. But without further ado, let's get right into it. At number 10, it's honestly a pretty simple little thing here. It's just going to be creature lands. So Blood Like Rivers added a half cycle of creature lands with different animation and creature conditions. In general, the most impactful of these has been the black-green one, Waking Bog. Its 2/1 stat line is fairly unimpressive, but its ability to grind out against opposing decks after trading off resources is unparalleled because of its combat damage into regrowth trigger. Waking Vista has also seen play in some of the blue-red prowess lists, as the deck is very blitzy and tends to fold to 1 or 2 removal spells. Waking Vista gives it additional oomph in that regard. And as Black-White has been one of the premier mid-range decks in the format, Waking Boneyard has also seen a lot of play. But even the red-white ones and blue-green ones have seen play elsewhere. Ultimately, the presence of creature lands makes just trading 1-for-1 a lot more difficult as a prospect, and makes it so that there are a lot more outs/threats available in the format that you have to consider, especially if you only have sorcery speed removal. So definitely going to be put some pressure on interactive decks, while also giving interactive decks low commitment win con if needed. Okay, next up, let's look at another land cycle, the Pain Land cycle. So I'm only showing one of these, but there's a full 10 in each 2-color pair. And with Kutalia leaving the format, one of the big concerns was definitely, what are we going to do for fast mana now that the shock lands are rotating out? We had untyped shocks from Kutalia. The Pain lands have come in and provided a really strong contender in that slot. Very similar play pattern of, you get to have fast mana, but in exchange you're going to be hurting yourself. And in the current meta, which is very aggro-oriented, this loss of life actually matters a lot. And so while we are in an era where there's incredibly powerful fixing and you can play 4-color decks as long as you're willing to pay up the cost in life or tempo, there is actually a punish for it. So these Pain lands are very impactful, but they also have a strong dynamic in the format. Also, the sack to draw is pretty relevant for lots of mid-range decks and even aggro decks if the game goes long and they're running out of gas. It can sometimes just lead to that one hasty top deck that they need. It's also really good for enabling Ancient, which is one of the keywords from Blood Like Rivers, which cares about having 8 or more lands on the graveyard or battlefield. So overall, those 2 land cycles have really altered the landscape of how people build mana bases and what sort of punishes there are to those mana bases. Next up, let's look at a group of 2 cards. I'm going to call these the Green Ancient 2-drops. It's Old Ways Advocate and Gift of Deadwoods. Now, Gift of Deadwoods' text might be a little small, so let me read it out. It's an enchantment aura with Enchant Land. When it enters the battlefield, you mill 3 cards and return a creature or land card milled this way to your hand. At the beginning of combat on each player's turn, if you're ancient, you may have enchanted land become a 4/4 elemental creature until end of turn. So these two cards together provide strong incentive to go into ancient for mid-range decks. They're cheap beaters that, in the case of Old Ways Advocate, either enhances your Gift of Deadwoods, or in the case of Gift of Deadwoods, gets you to ancient itself while also just being a good cantrip on its front side. Both of these cards have really revitalized Jund style archetypes in their own right. And in a format that is really caring about scaling cheap threats, they're positioned in a very strong way. Gift of Deadwoods in particular is one I would call out as potentially seeing play in multiple archetypes. There was a black mid-range deck that splashed green exclusively for Gift of Deadwoods. So if I had to choose one for this slot that I've cheated on a little bit, I think the card to look at here would definitely be Gift of Deadwoods. It's also really great with another card we're going to be seeing later, which allows you to mass flicker stuff. And Gift of Deadwoods, of course, if you're getting value off the ETB multiple times, you're just pod racing at that point. Next up, we're going to have another cheatsy pair over here. It's a group of 2 Prowess 1-drops. Blue-Red Prowess was already a very potent blitzy aggro deck. In fact, it won a Grand Prix at one point, thanks to the presence of cards like Spite Dragon and Draconic Disciple from Karsus. However, with these new additions, it has only gotten better, and it's a terrifying, terrifying blitzy deck. Twincast Disciple, you really don't care about the second line of text. The most important part of it is that it's a 1-drop with prowess. Renegade Apprentice, while it doesn't have true prowess, being a hasty 1-drop that also becomes a 2/2 with first strike whenever you cast a non-creature spell is really potent. And together, both of these cards make it so that you can have hands where, as long as your opponent, because again, we've seen like there are chances that decks are going to be trying to do some 4-color, slow, dirtily stuff. Like if you're tapping out for Gift of Deadwoods on 2, these decks can go 1-drop, 2 more 1-drops, turn 3, drop 3 non-creature spells and just kill you. And this increases the consistency / possibility of that. So these Prowess 1-drops are definitely, have definitely made Blue-Red Prowess not just a deck present in the meta that is already strong, but one of the strongest aggro decks in the format. Though, of course, it's still very blitzy / if you have interaction in the first few turns, the deck's plan really does go sideways. Speaking of blitzy, though, let's go into number 6, Lucille, Ruthless Warlord. This is probably the single bombiest card on the list, and I define bombiest as having the most immediate impact as soon as it comes down. Lucille is going to win you the game the turn you play her, and if she doesn't, then something has gone very wrong, and you probably weren't winning that game anyways. Her ability to just double the damage of everything else you have means that she can come down and she has haste herself. So you can often go from your opponent being at 16 to 18 life to just being dead in a single turn cycle. Of course, it also doubles the damage that sources your opponent's control would deal to you, so that can lead to some really nasty situations, especially if they keep burn up. And if you're not hard casting her, if you're escaping her, you're definitely making that play pattern a lot more possible. But Lucille has definitely burst onto the scene and cemented a reason for black-red midrange to exist in the format. And I think that her ability to create an entire archetype around her is definitely worthy of having this spot on the list. Next up, we're going to be looking at another powerful red haster. It's Blood Frenzied Vanguard. Blood Frenzied Vanguard, I think, single-handedly revitalized mono-red aggro. So, aggro decks in the past have usually had to have a gimmick in some way. Mono-red has traditionally been a pretty weak aggro archetype, and while it can work, like, this is a standard format, which is usually slightly slower, and aggro getting to prey on those people trying to dirtle and value is always, valuable. Blood Frenzied Vanguard in particular just being, hey, I'm a 3-mana, 5-power trample haster. And in addition, uh, I'm not actually a ball lightning. If you have ways to sacrifice permanents, you usually don't even need like aristocrat stuff going on because there's a lot of treasure support slash gold support from Karsus and Viridian's Last Mission, respectively. So you can have a lot of incidental artifacts that you can sack, maybe even to play Blood Frenzied Vanguard, that can keep it around and keep it wailing on your opponent. And even if your opponent blocks slash trades on curve, they're usually just going to be bolted by this. So overall, Blood Frenzied Vanguard is probably one of the strongest cards in mono red right now, and I think one of the biggest reasons to be running mono red over some of the other powerful aggro options. Next up, we've got Twilight Ambush. Now, we've been talking a lot about aggro being real good. Here's one great way to punish them. Twilight Ambush gives black, which has already been a very strong color removal-wise, a way to punish early plays in a way that it kind of didn't have before. Before, you had to either wait for Fatal Flaw, which was on 2 mana, be splashing for red for Ferocious Flame, or be playing stuff like Crucify, which costs you life, which isn't great in the aggro matchup. Here, Twilight Ambush allows you to essentially destroy most 1 and 2 drops on curve, and even some 3 drops. And in that sense, it's probably one of the strongest removal spells in the format right now. And it plus Fatal Flaw is one of the most powerful 1-2 punches in the format. I think obviously there's a lot of white removal that is currently underexplored, probably because black also has some powerful threats. But Twilight Ambush really fills in a niche that without its existence, I think black would struggle a lot more against aggro decks than it does. Next up, we're going to have In Search of Peace. So In Search of Peace is an insanely powerful engine. Its existence has single-handedly created multiple deck archetypes because of its ability to, at one point, you could create loops that would allow you to go infinite and take infinite turns, or recur a spell infinitely, which could be a silence or a fog. In quote-unquote fair applications, there are also a bunch of enchantments and creatures that you can just flicker for mass value. Overall, In Search of Peace is the real deal. There's not much to say about it. It's the only downside is that you need to cast other spells to activate it, so your opponent has a window to destroy it before you can get value out of it. But if you untap with it, you can often get like multiple procs of this per turn, especially if you're using this to flicker stuff which draws you cards, and then you're just off to the races. So yeah, in control, in mid-range, in toolbox, whether you're playing enchantments, artifacts, or creatures, In Search of Peace is probably the strongest value engine in the format right now. And if you're looking for some good old value town fun times, look no further. Next up, we're going to be looking at Reinstated Reaper. We talked about the strengths of black mid-range earlier. Reinstated Reaper comes in, like, crashes through the front door and is like, okay, you wanted strong, you've got it. Reinstated Reaper takes black's 2-drop suite, which is already quite impressive, and gives it one of the most powerful aggro curves in the format. Scaling threats are definitely the name of the game in the format right now, and Reinstated Reaper is arguably the best of them. It comes down on turn 2, it has evasion, because we saw the aforementioned pain lands, your opponents can trigger it themselves, and it can grow insanely fast if you're also proactively enabling Ancient on it. It just runs people over. It's also notable for, it's also just notable for after 2 triggers being missed by Ferocious Flame and Twilight Ambush, but also this is one of the main reasons that you really want Twilight Ambush in the mirror, because an early Reinstated Reaper on its own can just run away with the game. There's really not much else to say about it. It's cheap threats good. And the final cards on our list are going to be New Divide and Gilded Court. So once again, a little bit of cheating here, but New Divide and Gilded Court together form, I think, the most powerful core for basically any and all multicolored decks. Pain lands are usually there if you really need fast mana, but New Divide and Gilded Court together are present in almost every multicolored deck. Gilded Court is essentially you can read it, but it's basically just an evolving wilds that can later add more colors of mana if you're willing to take a turn off to give it more types. And New Divide is evolving wilds except it's a shock land, which is insanely powerful. New Divide, it triggers Revolt for cards like Blood Frenzied Vanguard. It helps with Ancient on its own, and it's obviously just a powerful fixing piece. It's crazy how much New Divide does in the format right now because of its applications with both of those keywords from Blood-like Rivers and just being a powerful fixing piece. I think, once again, if I had to choose one of these to be the number one, it would be New Divide. That card, I think it's strange. We started this list with lands and we're ending it with a land, but it's hard to overstate because lands can have impact in so many different archetypes and in so many different ways, and New Divide embodies that. So it may not be the flashiest, it may not be the spiciest, but New Divide is the single most impactful card from Blood-like Rivers in the Revolution format right now. Thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you next time. Make sure to check out the other videos in the month 1 series, especially, like I mentioned earlier, the meta review video, if you're interested in any and all of these cards. But yeah, until next time, see y'all.